So I'm going to lead into this week's video with a quote from Solution Zero on last week's review, which was about Quest for the Shaven Yak starring Ren Hoek and Stimpy for the Master System. Go check it out after this video if you missed it. It's a really interesting game. Anyway, Solution Zero has been a huge supporter of the channel for a long time, so I just want to say thank you to him real quick. The love is appreciated. But he said, "Great episode. Need more obscure titles, less sports titles." Well, I couldn't agree more. But you gotta understand, see, I hate success. It's terrible. Who wants to deal with all those comments and likes and subscribers and all that, and then invitations to assist other YouTubers? Oh, it's the worst. I really don't have time to be helping you out with your great, clearly better than my videos. I've got my own crappy channel to deal with here. Hey, Dudley, call me. Anyway, so having said that, what game have I got queued up for this week? Action 52, Stormlord, maybe Slaughter Sport, aka Mondu's Fight Palace, aka Tongue of the Fat Man? No, we're going with a game that's actually very topical at the moment due to the US losing in the FIBA World Cup this past weekend. And that would be Team USA Basketball for the Genesis. And yes, I can hear you clicking on the X to close your browser window. You're already gone. Well, all of you that are still here, thank you for sticking around. And if this happens to be your first visit to the channel, welcome. But you might have a few questions, so I'll go over the basics real quick. About 7-8 years ago now, I decided to start collecting games for the Sega Genesis, which wasn't my first console, but it was the console that I had the most fond memories of growing up. This grew into a desire to try and collect any game that I could play using a Genesis as a base, which of course includes the Sega Master System, Sega or Mega CD titles, and 32X games. But I didn't want to just collect a bunch of silicon and plastic and let it collect dust. I wanted to actually do something with it, and thus Zilog and Moto was created to house reviews of each and every one of these games behind me, with looks at not just the game, with footage captured from original hardware, but also the package, to try to give a feel for what it was like to pick one of these games off the shelf 30 or so years ago. Because you sure won't be doing it now. I mean, does GameStop even sell video games anymore? Or is it all just clearance pops and cringy t-shirts? But I digress. Team USA Basketball was released by Electronic Arts in August 1992 in the United States to coincide with the 1992 Summer Olympics in Barcelona, and then later on that year in both Japan and Europe as well. Olympic-based games traditionally skip over major sports like baseball, soccer, or basketball, as it's easier for developers to focus on a collection of simpler sports, rather than try to compete with games that are dedicated to those specific sports. So seeing a game based around specifically Olympic basketball is definitely a bit of an oddity, not just in the Genesis catalog, but pretty much as far as any console is concerned. So that begs the question, why? Why does Team USA Basketball exist? Especially because Electronic Arts had just released Bulls vs. Lakers 2 months before and would close out the Versus series just 6 months later with Bulls vs. Blazers. Seems like a lot of basketball in a short amount of time, doesn't it? Well, I'll get into more details about all that later on in the review, but suffice it to say, when you have the opportunity to make a basketball game starring the greatest basketball team ever assembled, you make that game. Let's take a closer look at the package, and then we'll talk about what dreams are made of. And this is my copy of Team USA Basketball. I'm going to go ahead and just say that this copy is in only decent shape. It could be a lot better, but it also could be a lot worse. The outer cover is held up well, with just a few small gouges and some odd wrinkling on the back. Yes, that's the clear plastic on the back that's doing that, not any kind of water damage. Don't think I've seen anything like that on these cases, to that extent anyway. And with it being an EA case, there's no hang tab to be removed at the top. The outer protector cover has done its job, and the inner cover still looks great, to the point where I can definitely tell I need to try to clean up the outside a bit. Like most sports titles, Team USA Basketball is a relatively common and available game, but due to it not being a traditional NBA-based basketball game, it is slightly more rare than one of those releases, so complete copies average around $20 right now. Or at least mostly complete copies anyway, as I'll get to in a minute. The front cover art couldn't get more patriotic without guns and bald eagles being involved, with a photo of the Dream Team front and center in front of an American flag background, and then Team USA basketball in red, white, and blue just below them. Europe got a slightly different version of the cover, with the elements rearranged a bit and more in line with EA's usual European cover formatting, but Japan, on the other hand, was like, American flag? Nah, we're not doing that. You can have a plain, very white background. I think I've got to give this round to the US version, for the simple reason that it's the one that I'm used to seeing. If you look down at the lower left-hand corner, you'll notice that this copy is a, quote, limited edition copy, which in all honesty is pretty meaningless and just means it's from one of the earlier batches. If you hadn't seen that before, for whatever reason, in 1992 and 1993, Electronic Arts created these limited editions of their sports titles, and they all had similar gold seals on them. It doesn't really make them any more valuable than the non-limited editions, as there's no difference between the two other than the seal, but hey, if you're collecting, might as well get the gold shiny one, right? Flipping over to the back and, well, that's definitely an interesting layout. The flavor text can be pretty hard to read on the background, which is unfortunate, but I suppose they at least got creative with it, including the full court scan at the bottom of the screen, which emphasizes the trapezoidal-shaped lanes that were used in international basketball at the time instead of the rectangular ones that you're probably more used to seeing. At the top it mentions how there's 15 international teams included in the game, which isn't a lot, but seeing as how there were only 12 teams that made the Olympics, I suppose that at least there's a few extra ones to choose from. One last thing, the special Skybox mini mural collector cards. Well, apparently this game originally came with 3 trading cards, but they are pretty hard to find these days. For instance, I only found 1 copy of the game on eBay that included any of the cards, and it only had 2 of the 3. This is what I was referring to earlier when I said mostly complete copies, because if you can find one with those cards still intact, well, more power to you. Opening up the package, and the manual is like the cover, slightly beat up, but intact. It's one of those earlier beefy EA Sports manuals that weigh in at 64 pages and almost includes too much information. But I certainly can't complain, especially in 2023 when manuals aren't really a thing anymore. And I do appreciate how they had write-ups for which players had which special moves, the rosters of each of the different teams, and then short biographies for each of the Dream Team players. None of that information had to be included, but EA did it anyway, so kudos to them. Okay, that's the package. Let's fire up this tournament and go for the gold. To lead into this review, I think I've got to discuss a little bit of the history surrounding the game, because without the formation of the Dream Team in 1991, this game simply would not exist, as Electronic Arts would have just gone about their business and released Bulls vs. Blazers and the NBA playoffs as the logical follow-up to Bulls vs. Lakers. But the Dream Team was a true spectacle that captured hearts and minds of basketball fans worldwide. Chuck Daly, who was selected as the head coach of the Dream Team, was quoted as saying that it was like the Beatles and Elvis together, as far as when fans would try to get glimpses of the team around Barcelona. And in the summer of 1992, when the team's participation in the Tournament of the Americas to qualify for the Olympics, and then later in the actual Olympic competition, if you were turned into ESPN, you were probably going to hear something about that team. Even if you weren't into sports, McDonald's, who has often been a sponsor of Olympic teams over the years, had a promotion going on around that time for collector's cups with their meals, with a cup for every player on the team. The buzz was simply everywhere. If you're younger and weren't around for the Dream Team, you'd be forgiven for not understanding what the big deal was. If you're talking about Team USA basketball in 2023, that team was just bounced out of the medals in this year's FIBA competition, finishing behind Serbia, Canada, and an undefeated German squad that, oh by the way, only had 4 NBA players on it, and none of which have ever made the All-Star team. Now, granted, that's not a totally fair comparison, because winning an Olympic medal is certainly considered a higher prize than the FIBA World Cup. So it makes sense that the Olympics' best and brightest weren't on display this year. But the whole point is, the interest level in international basketball in the United States has certainly waned a bit over the last 30 years. So, what was special about that 1992 team? Well, prior to the Barcelona games, things were different. FIBA had a rule that professional players specifically couldn't compete in the Olympics, with the intention behind the rule being to promote amateur athletics. Due to the United States' dominance in basketball in general, the lack of NBA players being included on Team USA didn't tend to hurt them in international competition, as usually even the best collegiate players in the United States, that would soon be in the NBA, had no problem taking care of international teams. Aside from the controversial 1972 Munich Games, Team USA had won every Olympic gold medal that they had competed for. That is, until the 1988 Olympics in Seoul, South Korea, when the US was beaten by the Soviet Union in the semifinals. Clearly, losing to the Soviet Union in one of the United States' best sports at the height of the Cold War didn't go over well. And while the Soviet Union wouldn't exist the next time the Olympics would roll around, the loss was enough for things to change at FIBA. Now, technically, the United States voted against the rule change in 1989 that would begin to allow professional basketball players to play in the Olympics. If I can put my conspiracy hat on for a minute, it seems awfully convenient that the rule was changed almost directly after the Seoul Games. Regardless of the reasoning or politics behind the rule change, the 1992 Olympics would be a different ballgame, pun fully intended. Team USA, now free to use its eligible players from the NBA, decided to throw down the gauntlet to ensure there wouldn't be a repeat of 1988, and created what would be known as the Dream Team, literally, and inarguably, the best collection of basketball players to ever exist. And there have been some other great Team USA teams over the years since then, don't get me wrong, but 1992 was the perfect time for a team like this to be created. As a result, the team fully lived up to the hype, and during the Tournament of the Americas and the Olympic Games, the Dream Team would never face a serious threat, with only Croatia ever daring to even get within 32 points. It was clear that this was a special moment in history, and even though there would be later attempts to recreate that magic of the original Dream Team, none of them ever would be as dominant or magical due to the 1992 team existing at the perfect moment in time for both the players on the team being available and competition around the world not yet being at NBA level. Electronic Arts seized on this and released Team USA Basketball almost specifically just to tie in with the event. It's almost the sports equivalent of releasing a game based on a summer blockbuster movie, where the point of the game isn't necessarily to provide the best basketball game available, but as a fan service to all the kids out there that wanted to play as their heroes on the Dream Team and replicate their march to the historic gold medal. Now, think about that last paragraph for a second. How many games have been released over the years that were designed specifically to tie into a popular property rather than necessarily being designed to be good? It's unfortunately a lot. I've reviewed a few on this channel. Anyone remember American Gladiators on the Genesis from back in episode 28? Yeah, it's probably best if you block that one out. In the case of Team USA Basketball, it at least has one thing going for it, and that it was based on an established series of games. If you've played Lakers vs. Celtics, or its direct follow-up, Bulls vs. Lakers, you're going to be immediately familiar with Team USA Basketball. The game features a few tweaks to reflect international competition, such as the games consist of 2 halves rather than 4 quarters, and then the halves' maximum length is 20 minutes. With a shorter overall game time, players also only have 5 available fouls before fouling out instead of 6, and the lane in front of the basket is a trapezoid, wider to close to the basket, that was utilized in international play until 2010. So if you happen to watch any of this year's FIBA Cup and saw that the rectangular lane was used instead of the trapezoidal one, that's why. And then of course, rather than representing the NBA, Team USA Basketball represents the 1992 Olympic Games in Barcelona. And due to that, the game is made up of 14 national teams and then a bonus World All-Stars team, which can only be used in exhibition play. But other than all that, from a gameplay and engine perspective, if you've played one of the previous games in the series, then you've played this before. With the main focus in the game being the Olympic Games, when you start up tournament mode, you're going to see some things that you might not be expecting. However, one element has not changed, and that's the familiar Ron Barr, virtual announcer of the short-lived EA Sports Network. and he is here to not just intro and outro the games, but to also give us a geography lesson on each of the countries. That's right, before each game, Team USA Basketball turns into Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego briefly, and we're given a map of each country with some vital statistics and pictures of such, and then finally Ron gives us a brief synopsis of what makes that country special. I actually don't hate the way that Electronic Arts tried to sneak in some educational material to a basketball game, and honestly, if you've ever watched the Olympics, the networks love to just tell all these stories about the athletes and the countries besides just focus on the sports, so it actually fits right in. And also, just as a point of order, in the Olympics that year, a total of 12 teams qualified for the games, not 14. And then of the 14 teams included in the game, 3 teams that actually competed in the Olympics were left out, in Brazil, Puerto Rico, and Germany. So if you're looking for a game that accurately resembled the tournament in real life, well, they missed the mark slightly there. I personally don't think it's a huge deal, as all 3 of those teams lost in the quarterfinals anyway, but it does make you wonder why EA was going to include 2 extra teams that they had to remove anyone. Being that the game is representing the Olympic tournament, as opposed to some sort of season or playoffs, the game reflects that, with the 14 teams being split into 2 7-team pods, and then each of the 7 teams plays each other to determine the top 8 teams that advance to the quarterfinals. Simple enough, right? Well, in reality it is, but for some reason the developers decided to display the pool play with this fairly confusing crosshatch table that, if you take your time, you can figure out, but at first glance, it's pretty confusing. I think they would have been fine including the table, but they should have replaced the win percentage column with a simple win-loss record, as that would have made it much easier to determine who was where. One other issue I had with the game is that when you play in tournament mode, only the hardest difficulty, Showtime, is available. The game is still beatable in Showtime to be sure, and I did beat the game as part of doing this review, but the problem with playing in Showtime mode is that the computer has a tendency to not miss. And this is with me playing as the Dream Team. If anything, I should have been utterly crushing all comers, but no, I was frequently having to try to scratch out close victories while the computer shot a higher percentage than me, with it not being uncommon for the computer to finish a game shooting in the 70 to 80% range, or more. And there being very little that I could do about it. I mean, I suppose it caused the games to be competitive, but having the computer be that artificially accurate kills the feel of the game, especially when part of that is the result of the computer-controlled players on your team being dumb as a stump. It just doesn't really feel like basketball at times, unfortunately, and I don't remember it being quite that bad in Bulls vs. Lakers, so I was somewhat surprised. From a graphics and audio perspective, if you've played the previous games in the series, you should know what to expect. The game does have a better presentation style as far as replicating what an actual broadcast feels like than what came before, and I really like the fact that during gameplay, there's only the bare minimum of display elements, with the 30-second clock always on screen, but score updates only being shown when someone scores, or when you can see the arena scoreboard in the middle of the court. This is something that took some getting used to, but after a few games, I vastly preferred being able to focus on the game and not all the statistical noise. The game doesn't break any new ground from an audio perspective either, with all of the same sound effects being brought over from the previous games, including the always useful "shoot it" audio sample that reminds you to shoot anytime the shot clock gets a little too low. However, EA stalwart Rob Hubbard was brought in to do the soundtrack this time around, and I think he did a fantastic job with the renditions of the various national anthems for each of the countries. It's not a soundtrack that you're going to want to listen to outside of gameplay, but it is certainly quality. Team USA Basketball is an oddity to be sure, a game that was made to remember and celebrate a certain point in time and the formation of the Dream Team. Is it totally necessary? No, absolutely not, and I think most people could be forgiven for not seeking this game out to have in their collection. because honestly, it's not the best example of basketball in the world, and focusing on just the 1992 Olympics rather than the NBA as a whole makes it a very niche product. If something like this existed today, I feel like it would be just DLC for the current version of NBA 2K, rather than a standalone product. As a result, I'm giving Team USA Basketball 2 stars. It's not a bad game specifically, but it is somewhat limited, and chances are you're gonna feel like you've probably played it before. Okay, and that was Team USA Basketball for the Genesis. Being an NBA fan, this is a game that I'm glad exists because of just how special the original Dream Team was, and it's a moment in time that I don't think that we'll ever see again, with how the rest of the world has caught up with the US. But is it a game that everyone needs and should absolutely play? Nah, there's definitely way better 16-bit basketball games to sink your time and money into. This is one that I think is going to appeal to only a very specific type of fan or gamer. Next time on Zilog and Moto, well, that's really funny how things work. It's a game that I actually mentioned in this very video, and it doesn't have anything to do with sports, because thank the Lord I didn't end up with 2 sports games scheduled back to back. I mean, I suppose it wouldn't have been the end of the world, but I'm sure YouTube probably wouldn't approve. Anyway, this next game also comes in a pretty unique package that, if you weren't around back in the day, you may never have seen. Which of course means it's a pain in the ass to try to find a protective case for, but I guess that's part of why collecting's an adventure, right? Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 212. If you like what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.